The Columbian exchange between the Americas, West Africa, and Europe brought many things over to America: plants, animals, culture, human populations, as well as technology. But none was as deadly as the contagious disfiguring virus, smallpox, with this virus first having arrived in 1518 as a result of Christopher Columbus' second voyage to America. Once this virus hit the native populations, it spread quickly and became deadly, as the natives have never been exposed to smallpox before. Therefore, they had no immunity to it and had no idea of quarantining themselves to prevent spread. The smallpox virus was especially detrimental to Native American children, as their immune systems were particularly weak compared to that of an adult. After the Europeans arrived in America, they established training networks for the Native Americans, which allowed the spread of smallpox to almost every tribe that ran through these trade routes, with the death toll much heavier on islands and in tropical lowlands. Because the native culture was one based off of community, the disease spread quickly through tribes and made it difficult to stay alive. When members of tribes died, it was traditional of tribes to hold drinking and prayer services, further enabling the spread of the disease. The smallpox epidemic spread along trade routes and throughout the Americas, and was worsened as the Native Americans had no means of protecting themselves and frequently held social gatherings as their culture was based off of community. When the cases of smallpox affecting Native Americans first came to light, other tribes visited the sick, which further enabled the spread of the disease through continual contact. In the beginning, the natives thought the disease was religion-related. They believed that the disease was caused by either a lack of charm use, an intrusion of an object by means of sorcery, or the free soul's absence from the body. They also thought that they would not be affected if they were protected by spirits, as the people affected were all, quote-unquote, not protected by spirits. To make matters worse, fast forward 300 years to the time period 1837 to 1870, and the fact that then at least 4 different epidemics struck the Plains tribes. Soon, the tribes began to learn of quote-unquote white man's diseases and intentionally avoided contact with Europeans and their trade goods. However, these efforts did not last long because the benefits from trading were too alluring. The 1837 Great Plains smallpox epidemic was the most infamous of these epidemics. It spanned from 1837 to 1840 and reached its height after the spring of 1837 when the American Fur Company steamboat SS St. Peter carried infected people and supplies into the Missouri Valley. More than 17,000 natives died along the Missouri River alone, and some tribes became nearly extinct. Their dead bodies were buried in large pits or tossed into the river, which would have likely contributed to continued infection as the bodies remained infectious after death. The Great Plains epidemic spanned thousands of miles, reaching California, the northwestern coast, and central Alaska, before finally subsiding in 1840. The smallpox epidemic was also an example of the earliest instances of biological warfare. The siege of Fort Pitt took place during June and July 1763 in what is now Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This siege was a part of Pontiac's War, which was an effort by Native Americans to remove the British from the Ohio and Allegheny Plateau after the British failed to honor promises and treaties during the French and Indian War. However, the Native Americans' efforts to remove the British failed, as colonists gave Native American emissaries items infected with smallpox with the hope of spreading this deadly disease to nearby tribes. Since the turn of the 19th century, there have been sporadic efforts made to promote vaccination among the indigenous people. There were 3 major vaccination attempts. The first were vaccinations from the American Fur Company. Many traders hoped to obtain vaccines from the company, but the company was unwilling to heed their request, so this attempt had no success. The next was the Indian Vaccination Act of 1832, implemented by the government because smallpox outbreaks interfered with the removal of Native Americans from their land. Nonetheless, this was the U.S. Congress's first step to generating public support for vaccination of the natives. This act ultimately was not successful because the Office of Indian Affairs did not have the network or information necessary to vaccinate the Plains Indians quickly, and they also didn't bother establishing the needed network. The final and most successful vaccination effort was by the Hudson Bay Company. Early vaccination efforts by the company during their monopoly period was sporadic and unorganized, and there wasn't really a systematic vaccination program until the epidemic was well underway. However, the company soon started to emphasize vaccines since a reduction in the native population meant a reduction in the profit from furs they brought in. Their later attempt had a good information network, a supply of vaccines at posts, and a willingness among all for vaccination, which made it more successful than American responses. The vaccinations from the Hudson Bay Company and trade natives were critical to limiting the spread of smallpox in Canada. After the epidemic, the Hudson Bay Company implemented a territory-wide vaccination program, further reducing smallpox deaths. The short-term effects of the smallpox disease was that there are fewer people to hunt, plant crops, and support their society through physical means. With so many deaths, the Native Americans were also more vulnerable to the next epidemic. Smallpox also led to blindness and depigmented scars. Many Native American tribes prided themselves on their appearance, so the scars from smallpox affected them psychologically. Some Native Americans were unable to cope with the condition and took their own lives. The long-term effects include the severe loss of indigenous people and accompanying reduction in cultivated lands in the 16th century, most likely contributing to a global cooling event, or a quote-unquote little ice age. The death of so many Native Americans also gave an effect of a quote-unquote virgin wilderness. As settlements vanished, forests recovered, fields were abandoned, and wildlife populations increased dramatically. Another long-term effect of the smallpox disease was that there was a big loss of cultural knowledge transfer, with losses greatly weakening communities. The smallpox epidemic that happened in the 1600s greatly affected the Native American population, culture, and society. About 90% of all Native Americans died as a result of contact, and the native populations never fully recovered after that.